Well, thank y'all for showing up. There's been a bit of a mix-up in terms of the rooms, so I appreciate um, you finding your way here. We'll be talking about privacy and kind of what to look forward to if you are in the realm of understanding your privacy's implementations, kind of how to prepare, and talk about a little bit about futures in terms of how I think privacy will be moving. So my name is Kumar. I'm a product manager at Unbound ID. Unbound ID has been working with a large number of brands across a large number of industries, or breadth of industries, on particularly how they engage customers' authentication, how they manage their privacy and preferences. And so we kind of bring that to the table to help share and evangelize some of the concerns around privacy and what we think should be done about it. So if you haven't been following privacy, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. If you go back a number of years, while privacy has been talked about in a lot of different circles, but I think it was elevated when the classified documents that were leaked by Snowden really hit the papers and really brought to question as to what is our relationship with not only our government, but with technology companies that we engage with. And you saw companies kind of put in an awkward position, like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and saying that we're bounded to share information with these agencies, but at the same time, we're also want to respect your privacy, right? And they want to be a little bit more transparent about that, as to what's happening, but it's still an ongoing legal battle between the government and these tech companies. But I think the interesting thing that really perked up, at least from my perspective, as to what would really drive some change in terms of policy as well as law, was that safe harbor, which is an agreement between the European Union and the US government, was nullified by the European courts. And what that means is that essentially that US companies that do work in Europe or operate in Europe will start to adhere, and not only with data residency requirements, but also things around consent as far as how information is used. You shortly saw after that, though, which again perked my interest, is that GDPR, which is a General Data Protection Regulation from the European Union, was agreement. That's a body of work that's been going on for 4 years, and they agreed on the language, which was significant because it set the stage for at least discussions around how does global companies operate in Europe, and how do they handle privacy for European citizens. Shortly thereafter, in the face of Safe Harbor being nullified, Privacy Shield, which is kind of the replacement of Safe Harbor, took into account what the GDPR was outlining and gave an option, or at least a proposal to the European Union to say, this is how we would like to, the US government or the US entities would like to handle that. Right around that same time, the GDPR was approved, right? So the clock started ticking, essentially. So this goes in effect. And you get a response back from the European Union about Privacy Shield was rejected, right? It wasn't sufficient, right? And we have technically till May 2018, if you're a US company operating in Europe, to comply, right? Until financial fines start hitting, right? So you got a compressed timeline, right? There's a number of events that happened before, but in the last 6 months, you saw a significant amount of details and significant conversations we're having with companies and prospects around what do we do? Where do we begin? So we thought it would be good to kind of talk about fundamentals of what you can start thinking about around privacy. Where do you start? Which for a security crowd may not be as interesting, but nevertheless doesn't mean it needs to be said. And then where do you start moving forward in terms of concepts like consent? How do you maintain transparency? And as well as customer controls of their data. So, real quickly, nothing too surprising, but start with encryption, right? Where is your customer's data? Protect it, right? There's still a number of use cases and instances that we see that, for whatever reason, political, technical, performance, that encryption is not used where customer data is involved, right? And it's not just at the data store itself. You have to think about where that data is distributed. If you think of data as an asset, and as an asset, you only monetize it when it's leveraged. And when it's leveraged, it means it's distributed, right? And so that you need to follow that practice wherever that data exists. So that includes reports, data warehouse systems, analytics, BI reports, as well as backups, log files, so on and so forth. So you really have to kind of have a comprehensive look at how you maintain that data and how you encrypt it. Data in motion, which again is a corollary to how you leverage the asset, use TLS, right? There's always been this notion of behind the firewall it's safe, right? And time again, that's proven to be not true, right? So don't just make it baked into your architecture decisions, your performance considerations. TLS is going to be used. Excuse me. As far as the data store itself, right? And this is something that I guess is debatable. Choose a data system that takes a always deny approach, similar to a firewall, right? If you've worked in network security, you understand a firewall typically does not allow connections in and out by default, right? As a protection mechanism. Treat your customer data that way, just like your network, right? Understand, pick solutions that say, we're going to protect the data first, and if you know your clients, if you're comfortable with your clients and rules you've defined to allow specific data, specific operations out, then open it up, right? Knowing your clients is an important part of that relationship between the data store and the application teams, right? There's been a number of breaches that have been detected that went undetected for a number of times, but simply because an admin was looking at the traffic and didn't recognize a pattern, right? Or it seemed unusual for that specific application to be behaving in that way. Typically, it's a single transaction type application, all of a sudden it's doing a bunch of searches, right? Those type of profiles, however mundane it may be, do feed into the kind of the shared responsibility of protecting customer data. And finally, when assessing a storage system, make sure you always consider strong authentication. Right? There's not a single reason why your administrator should not have to provide the multiple factors to get into your account or be monitored. There's plenty of privileged access management tools out there that help you protect who gets in and who gets out of your customer data stores. Right? Just real simple. Difficult to implement, but simple concepts. So kind of thinking ahead, consent is a big part of a number of topics. Specifically, we go back to GDPR, and if you look at kind of current business practices around what consent actually means, how do you deliver on making sure you have consent, right? Today, everybody's familiar with Google and Facebook notion, where if you want to reuse your Google account or your Facebook account, you log in, and the application, or Facebook says, this application is requesting your email address and your basic profile information. Do you consent to using it, right? If you use another, let's just say Apple iTunes, right? Every time there's a software update or a change in their terms and conditions, you get this long document and say, do you agree, right? How many of you actually read that document? In that document, you've consented, right? So I don't really consider T's and C's, terms and conditions, as consent, even though it's baked in, it's legal, but it's not something that you are acknowledging that you agree to share that data. Even though by saying agree you do, it's not the way we should work. It needs to evolve. We need to be specific about data. What specifically are you going to use? How are you going to use it? How often are you going to use it? Are you going to stop using it? Right? Those are topics that around consent you need to get more and more comfortable with. And as an enterprise, that's challenging, right? Not the fact that you're capturing consent, but because you have to enforce it, right? Enforcing consent becomes very difficult for an enterprise to really think about. Again, if you go to my previous statement about data as an asset, you leverage an asset, which means it's distributed. How do you protect a distributed system where consent's involved, right? The basic premise is that you filter data, right? And say that you exclude information from parties that do not have consent from that specific data owner. You can use centralized policies, and there's working bodies that are working on, like UMA, User Managed Access, that give the resource owner specific controls of how data is released. There's other groups, and this is more on the research side, that around how do you encapsulate data. So when it's sent to a particular person, a particular app, that there's information, meta information, I think they call it descriptive logic, around how that information is intended to be used and for how long. It's still up to the application to enforce, but still it's a step forward in terms of how you really enforce consent. Enforcing consent across your applications, across your enterprise, really allows you to become transparent, which is the next big step, I think, that companies need to become very comfortable, be comfortable with. How are you sharing your data? Right? First, acknowledging, I think, would be a good step that your data is being shared, right? I recently purchased a home, right? And I was pleased by this mortgage lender, right? They gave me a sheet that said, by signing this document, you're agreeing to share your information this way, and we're not going to use it this way, right? But I couldn't select anything, right? It was just, this is a statement. This is what we're going to do with your data. And for the most part, it didn't, it met most of my standards in terms of they're not going to share it with third parties. They're only doing it for the processing of my mortgage application, which was great. But I've seen others that said that we're going to be sharing with everybody, and you get to call some number or you go to some random address, create an account, and decide what your options are, right? Instead of at the time of a transaction. And it still doesn't give you information, right, about how frequently they're planning on using it and for how long. And then I wouldn't be able to find out the last time it was accessed and by who, right? They just generically say third party, right? I think that's part of the challenge of whether I'm trying to make a decision if I want to interact with you is how do I know how my information is being used, right? And I think it's an opportunity to change the relationship around privacy with companies, right? If you are using their data and they are deriving value from it, tell them, right? If I'm engaged with a retailer and I agree to share my information with their, let's just say for discounts, I need to know that, right? We're sending this emails to you because you've consented to it because you get these discounts. And guess what? You've used these discounts. Oh, that'd be great, right? I want to continue using it. On the other hand, there may be scenarios where I consented to something maybe a year ago, right? Let's just say a delivery service, and I haven't bought anything since then, right? And at some point I may go in and see that, hey, you shared your consent with us. You haven't used that service. Do you want to keep that consent? And I think that's an important discussion to have because consent implies data is being shared. Data being shared opens up a risk vector if you're thinking about breaches. If you're thinking about how information is traveling throughout your system, right? And a client application has the right to ask for that information. And if it's continuously being shared and doesn't need to be, you can eliminate a risk, right? It's a different way of looking at how data is being shared and how do you control it. But changing the relationship becomes an important part of building your brand and trust with that company or with that customer. From transparency, I think the natural transition to be give customers control, and this is where GDPR and other efforts that are going on in the privacy space really take hold. And really, there's two aspects to it. There's the policy side and there's the technology side. How do you actually do this? And again, there's standards bodies, which I'll mention again at the end, that are working on making this an ecosystem that everybody can participate in. But conceptually, what I want to talk about is today sharing data is perpetual, right? There's not a notion of how long, what is appropriate, right? There are industries that are taking steps to advance that you need to do attestation every year. You need to make sure you have a consent that's fresh from that customer, right? What I'd like to see step forward is at the time of consent, I want to be able to set how long I can share. Can I share for just 30 days? And then ask me if I want to renew, right? Or just like a credit card on a monthly subscription service, you just say auto renew, right? And at the time of when it expires, it automatically triggers another consent for it on your behalf, right? Convenience is an important part of this, right? I don't think it's realistic to expect everybody to consent to manage their consents for every single specific attribute, but there's a notion of being mindful of how you're sharing your information with that entity. The ultimate kind of consent management that people freak out about And I guess the nuke button is the right to be forgotten, to remove your digital legacy with a company or an entity, right? That's a hard problem to solve. And it's not something, even today, it's required for specific companies in the EU. But if you think about all the concepts that I talked about earlier about how you have data is typically distributed, you're protecting it across multiple enterprise applications like data warehouse, analytics, CRM systems, your identity authentication engagement systems, your content management. Try to remove every record of that person across all that, right? Having controls in the front end of that really make it easier, right? Because your consents are not audited. You can understand where data has went, right? What was removed, and it allows you what I think to be right to be forgotten a little bit easier. And a space where I think we haven't spent enough time talking about is in analytics, right? I don't know if this is a term or not, but I was just thinking about it. Like, what do you call computable PII, right? If you look at what's going on in analytics, in terms of the number of sources of information, right? They can't say it's your name or your specific social security or your ID, but they can get your address or they can get your location, right? And they can correlate that with other streams of data, right? To get a better picture of who a person might be. And then there's statisticians, data scientists that can reasonably expect statistically that this is probably 1 to 3 people, right? And with additional information, they can narrow it down further and further and further, right? It could be activities, right? There's the easy example of every year, New York City taxi company publishes all their route information they did for the year. So you can pick an address and see where they went most frequently, right? What establishments did they go to? And guess what? You can look up that address and determine who lives there. And guess what? Based on the establishment, you can probably profile which person is probably going most frequently, right? You can do that for work. You can do that for where you shop. You can do that for a lot of different areas, right? There's also marketing companies or startups that are looking at, it's increasingly harder and harder to get people to register, right? But I see traffic, and I see a lot of repeat devices. And I have a lot of different channels, because that's my job, to engage with all kinds of customer groups. And I want to figure out if that device is the same device across all of these different areas, right? It's going to be really hard to be anonymous in the future, right? You don't have a way to really protect that type of information because it's just activity, right? You're not giving any information. You're not sharing it with them. It's just they're figuring it out. Over time, they'll get enough of information about you to be able to say, this is probably this person, right? And they're getting more and more data as quickly as possible, right? Data complex is something that has a significant amount of money behind to really drive experiences, right? It's in the name of making your life better. It's in the name of helping you kind of find services and products that really make your life easier or more convenient. But the challenge is that where's your control? That's not being designed in, right? What aspect do you have that you will have a say in how that information is being used? So, kind of looking at it at the whole of it, start with simple basics in terms of protecting data around encryption, TLS. Start looking at consent. I think it's going to be a reality in your system designs that you have to take into account. I think every industry is going to have to be seriously considerate. If you're a company that's looking at being an IDP, right, for an ecosystem of developers and applications, your information that's at your company will need to be shared with that application. Consent. That's going to involve consent, right? And that means you have to enforce consent. At some point, I think in the near future, as we spend the next year thinking about how we really drive customer experience and the brand relationship, transparency, customer controls really affect technology solutions. And ultimately, where I think it has to flow into is into analytics, right? If You want to learn more, I highly recommend from a policy perspective, get involved with IAPP. There's a great resource of information about the topics and discussions and policy aspects. If you want to get involved from a technology perspective and the standards that are using to really drive some of this, Eve is here. She can talk all about user-managed access and where that's going. We also can talk about HART if you're in the healthcare arena. Or come talk to us. Open it up for questions. I appreciate everybody's time. Yes?
We were talking about encryption, and you mentioned that you don't think it's safe to have PII unencrypted behind the firewall.
Yep.
If you have all your systems are on-prem, why do you think it's not safe?
I think that there's not a foolproof system that can't be hacked. And as soon as they're in your network, they have full access to your entire data system.
If they get in our network, we have bigger problems.
Well, yeah, but this is specifically around privacy. But yes, we've talked about security in layers, right? And I think at a fundamental level, when you start outside in, that's one way to look at it. If you start inside out, talk about your customer data, right? And you start saying, well, how do I protect this from as many possible vectors as I can? And protecting that data is kind of the first thing I think you should do. All right, well, we'll be at the booth this afternoon. We have a number of sessions. I'm here for the next 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you.